So this is a really interesting opportunity because as someone who is sort of trying to raise money and build cities and rent space, I sometimes lose sight of the fact of what's really either the economic imperatives or the real data. So to meet someone and be able to exchange points of view here, it's going to be a great opportunity.
Oh, and it's just as important for me, who sits in my office and sometimes walks around cities, to actually talk to someone who actually builds cities and actually makes cities happen. So I think I'm very grateful for this chance.
To put a little personal context on it, back in 2011, when you came out with Triumph the City, I was just starting Hudson Yards in New York City, and I was raising a family in New York City, but now I don't live in New York City, and now I live in Houston, in the Woodlands, and the world's changed a lot. And so what are your thoughts in terms of what's transpired since you wrote the first book?
Well, first of all, it's great to be talking to you. It's great to be talking to you about cities, and it's great to be talking for an academic, to be talking to someone who actually builds cities, and that's a fantastic thing. Over the past 12 years, certainly there have been hiccups in the urban roads that we've experienced. And it's important to stress that even before COVID, things were fraying. Mm-hmm. There were things that were edging even before the sort of massive deurbanization of the world, in a sense, that happened during COVID, during lockdown, and the fact that we still haven't managed to get past it in many ways. So let's just talk through a couple of the ways in which things seem to be fraying. So one, of course, was the affordability problem. And that was there in 2011. That plays a major role in the book. I sort of frame it very much in a traditional economist structure of thinking about supply and demand. And part of the fact that New York and Boston and Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles were becoming affordable was about robust demand for urban spaces. The fact that these places, which looked very troubled in the 1970s, had come back, and in some cases had come back magnificently, that created demand for those spaces. And that's part of that's part of what made housing less affordable. On the other hand, the other side of affordability is lack of supply. There was plenty of demand for New York in the 1920s, but the city permitted more than 100,000 units a year during some of those years. And as it built, it stayed affordable to ordinary people to find their future in New York. That really hasn't been happening since, for 60 years in New York, that you've had anything like the kind of massive construction you do in Houston. And that, of course, is why Houston is affordable, right? You do in Atlanta, you do in Dallas, you do in Phoenix. But that was sort of the starting point for me of the fraying. And that's accompanied by issues around public safety, policing, and issues about upward mobility in cities. I mean, we have a whole new set of data that's been brought to the table by my colleague Raj Shetty and his co-authors that suggests that even though cities are great for upward mobility for adults who come there, right, they really are not great for kids. And, as much as I loved my own childhood in New York and thought I had amazing experiences in it, right, on net, the Chetty data typically shows that kids who grow up within central city school districts do much worse than the kids who grow up just outside those school districts. It shows that actually even within cities, people who live in dense urban cores typically do worse, even holding parental income constant, than kids who grow up in less dense areas. And so this is sort of one of the things that cities need to think of is how to make sure that, to me at least, cities are always places of inequality, right? I mean, it was Plato who wrote in the Republic that every city of whatever size is in reality two cities, one a city of the rich, the other a city of the poor, and they are always at war with one another. That inequality is not something that cities should apologize for, right? Cities are unequal because they're really fun places to be rich, and they're less intolerable places to be poor because of better access to social services, public transportation, and so forth. But that inequality, which is really natural in cities, is only tolerable if cities are providing pathways out of poverty, if they're providing escalators to opportunity.
That's interesting that some of the comments you're making about New York in the 20s, and I'm wondering if there's a kind of I won't call it an optimum size, but is scale one of the problems? So when you've got a city of 8 million people, and you've got rich and poor, you're going to have fabulous wealth and a lot of poor people. When we talk about the Woodlands, it's 120,000 people. Great school systems, great social cohesion. They're very diverse. They're typically more diverse than the metroplex they're associated with. And that starts to sort of chip away at those other issues that you see are fraying in the bigger cities. And also the ability to move more rapidly to address whatever changes are required. So in the case of housing, we can produce it so much more quickly in Texas or Arizona or Nevada, including transit, mass transit, the ability to shorten the commute. So that supply and demand is broken in the big cities, but very vibrant in these smaller cities.
So there are two things going on there. One of which is scale, and the second of which is sort of the nature of the urban space. So, for example, Cambridge, Mass, where we are right now, it's a moderately sized city that enables it to handle some things that would be different from New York, but building here is enormously difficult, right? This is not a place in which it's easy to build. It has all the same. It's public transit dependent, and so there's all the complexity that comes with that. Whereas, in some sense, much of America is a featureless plain. I'm exaggerating, but it makes just things very easy to lay down stuff fresh, and that's part of what makes things cheap. So I think it's both the nature of the space and also the scale of it that can challenge things. One way of thinking about scale is particularly in the urban office market, where for most of the past 50 years, if you think about the Northeast and the Midwest, New York and to a lesser extent Chicago really skated above their nearby competitors, right? It was the sort of mid-sized Rust Belt cities that were the epicenters of American despair, the Detroits, the St. Louises, the Clevelands. But New York floated above. New York is one of the only sort of colder one of the 10 largest cities in 1950 that actually has more population today than it did then. Probably not now, actually, but it did in 2020.
They lost 400,000 more or less.
And that the size of New York made it happen. If you look for the past 3 years, since 2019, since COVID hit, that vast size, which was such a help for much of the past 50 years, that has really become a hindrance. Yeah. And the fact that you've got such a specialized, vast office market, and it's still half empty, right? At least, and that's become a major weight pulling the city back instead of pushing the city forward.
Yeah, I think that's true. Also, we find what's important to our communities, be it Summerlin, the Woodlands, or Columbia, it's extremely important that we have a vibrant office market, and because you have to have a place of employment right there in the community. So I think one of the distinctions that we would make, between suburban communities and what we would call edge cities, is an edge city is a city. Like, it has commerce, it has hotels, it has culture, it has performing arts, it has schools, it have art galleries, and therefore it's got the same 24/7, lesser than New York to be sure, but it's a functioning economy. In the Woodlands, for instance, Occidental Petroleum is headquartered there, and they can walk out and go to the mall or go down the street and have a drink or meet friends at the coffee shop, and then whip home in 15 minutes to watch the kids' soccer game. That, I think, is what really powers these cities, is that the ability to respond to commercial needs. And what we're finding too, post-COVID, is all those office tenants are shrinking, but these edge cities don't get overbuilt. So we have 2 million square feet, 2.5 million square feet in Columbia, 5 to 6 million square feet in the Woodlands, not 300 million square feet like New York does. So that gives us more flexibility to respond. And what I find very interesting, you talk a lot about the importance of an entrepreneur to the success of a city. So we have a community called Bridgeland. It's 20,000 people now. It's only about 10 years old. Just starting our first commercial, sold land to a commercial user. We've got, supermarket coming in, building a town center. Of those 20,000 people, 40% work from home. And then you would say, when you look at co-working space, co-working is much more strongly occupied in the edge cities or the suburbs than it is in the inner city. Those are the entrepreneurs. So to some degree, the entrepreneurs, in the historic sense, would feel a need to go to Chicago, San Francisco, or New York, that's where you had to go to get started and build a client base and market yourself and get financial backing. Now you don't necessarily need to do that. And so if you're a young college grad from the Midwest, whereas you used to automatically migrate to the big city, now it's not such a given. You can migrate to a lot of different places, which has changed the nature of the workforce. And now the employers have to respond to that, because they can't take it for granted that they're going to find the best workforce in New York City or Chicago or San Francisco.
So one way to think about this is if you think about the long-term impact of Zoom, right, particularly on sort of younger entrepreneurial people, I think the odds that many, 30-somethings who are part of a small, young organization are going to want to just Zoom it from home is pretty low.
Yeah.
But, they may well want to do it from the Woodlands. They may well want to do it from Austin. They may well want to do it from some, mid-sized community, particularly one that has, no state income taxes, for example,
exactly.
or has ready access to skiing. And what Zoom has made possible is for them to connect to their venture capitalists via Zoom, or connect to their attorneys, or do all of the things which are not daily interactions, but they sort of regularly need to happen.
Right.
That can all be virtual. What that means for cities is the competition for talent has just gotten much hotter.
Yeah.
And that means that, in fact, the sort of New Yorks, the San Franciscos, the Bostons need to fight even harder. Part of the problem is that because of these ways in which urban life was framed, there were all these pressures, particularly to take progressive actions prior to 2020, whether or not that was delivering more affordable housing, whether or not that was having, more interventions for, kids from high poverty neighborhoods, whether or not it was making sure the police aren't mean to people. All of these things were areas in which there was lots of pre-existing pressure. The problem is that if you try to sort of right the social wrongs that exist in cities by taxing the rich and taxing businesses, they'll just leave, right? We saw that in the 1970s. We saw the progressive dreams of people like John Lindsay come flat up against the reality that, suburbs were growing and container ships made it easier to ship stuff. And, New York teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. And I worry a lot that sort of this combination of Zoom enabling mobility with a real progressive and a really understandable progressive urge to take aim at these inequities, that this can create a real urban crisis going forward.
Yeah. It's interesting also, I think, in the sense that, so Bridgeland is, say, 10 years old, and the Woodlands is coming up on its 50th anniversary. So both of them have the same average income, which is easily 2.5 times the average income of Houston. They both have equal amounts of college education, and they have basically the same interest. But the difference is that in Bridgeland, the average age is 20 years younger than the average age in the Woodlands, because that's the place that the millennials have decided they're going to next. And so when you think of the size of this migration that's occurring across the country, it's going to be really, to your point, the cities are really going to have to compete for this crowd, because when they're going in their 30s and 40s, they're going to be settling. They're not going to, and it'll be too late. They're not going to go back to the gateway cities. So then the gateway city has to get the next generation, and all those fraying that you're talking about has just got frayed even further.
I mean, the good news is there are certain ways in which cities equilibrate, right? I mean, New York right now feels really unaffordable. And, if you have a decade of decline and trouble, it will be much more affordable as it was in the 1970s.
Exactly right. Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, some people say New York goes in 20-year cycles. And so, we're hopefully getting near the bottom of a 20-year cycle, and it'll start to come back again, because it won't go away. It's the finance capital of the world, the cultural capital of the world.
Physical stock is there.
Exactly. It's like, so it's not that I don't think you have to feel sorry for the gateway cities, but I do believe it's a bonus for America, because now you've got more places that people can go and choose to live and choose to raise a family. And it's starting to sort of equilibrate a little. And these cities now are starting to build their own cultures. As they get more mature, they introduce culture into the community, and that becomes local, if you will, homebred. But also, I think it gets imported. They start to, aspire to better architecture, better public square, better urban planning. As you point out, in the Woodlands, in the case of Columbia too, with Jim Rouse, they started with a very, very unusual vision. And I think that vision now is really starting to pay dividends 50 years later. And that's why a lot of these edge cities are actually pretty mature. They've been around for a long time.
Columbia and the Woodlands have been around.
Or here in Cambridge. I mean, they're not sort of brand new entities. But they are maturing in a way which I think is interesting. And so the question then becomes, does the flight continue?
One way to see this is I'm a big fan of competition among companies. I'm also a big fan of competition among cities. And that, in some sense, is the process that you're describing, is one in which, places are competing for talent. Within those places, there are cultural entrepreneurs who are trying to figure out their own way to sort of make art that's great and make a living at the same time. And all that is exactly as it should be. I do worry a little bit about Texas following the path that California and New York have trod before it, in terms of allowing their entrepreneurs the freedom to sort of make their futures, right? So in some sense, if you think about, 110 years ago, basically it was easy to build anywhere. There weren't there wasn't a straitjacket of regulations that bound everything. 1916, New York puts in its first major zoning ordinance that then gets ratcheted up in 1960, and place after place has increasingly made it difficult to provide new space. There's a parallel thing which goes on in terms of the regulation of entrepreneurship, the regulation of occupations, and I worry a lot that places that once seemed like they were safety valves for, the building that makes housing affordable, as well as sort of creative, new forms of entrepreneurship, that they're actually becoming more regulated, becoming more like the coasts, and that's a worry that I have going forward on this, and that's what pushes back against the competition among places, which is so inherently healthy.
I think that's a legitimate worry, actually. We start to see it, although it's interesting. Like for instance, you take Arizona. So we were trying to figure out why is it Arizona keeps growing and growing and growing. It's not like Houston, which is the oil and gas industry, or New York is the finance industry, or the Washington-Baltimore corridor, which is the government industry. Like, what is it about Phoenix? And our conclusion was that it's the most affordable city in America, that the average median income fit exactly with the average median house price. That model really seems to be driving an awful lot of what's going on today. And now you'll add on top of that, well, we don't necessarily know if we have enough water. I mean, they do have enough water if they manage it properly. But on the other hand, the barriers are starting to crop up. The regulations are starting to crop up. And that will slow things down. The ability that we have in our communities is we can respond immediately to market demand. So if there's a demand, we can build it. Whereas in the more sophisticated cities, there's market demand, well, get in line. And that's a real problem.
Yeah. I mean, the water issue is there is this desalination technology, right, that is out there, and potentially it's doable. It is expensive. It's not necessarily environmentally great, but it's a thing where, at least when I've benchmarked the sort of cost of this relative to the incomes in a place like Phoenix, feels kind of doable, if not necessarily the best of all answers relative to just better management.
Right.
Now, of course, I also worry a lot about cities in the developing world where that is not an affordable expense at all.
Right. That's not right. Exactly. Right.
I mean, I would say make the same point about adaptation to global warming, which is, seawalls or whatever we think it takes to make America's coastal cities safer. It's going to be expensive as anything, but we're American, we can probably afford this. How are we going to make the cities of the developing world safe from water when, there's both a limitation of just ability to spend, and the limits on the functioning of their governments are also extreme.
Well, in the case of seawalls, and we should copy the Germans and the Dutch, they just let it flood, and then they figure out how to get the water back out. And I think there's always a sort of a more kind of typical solution or a more practical solution to some of these issues. In the case of coming back to water, I mean, we've been building in Summerlin in Nevada now for 30 plus years. You're not allowed to have a lawn in your house, and you can only have a lawn even in the public space if it's used for recreational purposes. And as a result, and all of the gray water is filtrated on site and repatriated. And I think if you keep going, and so you can then recharge the land, the idea of drip irrigation versus flood irrigation, which we're continuing to do in this country, which is extraordinary to think about it. We can cut consumption enormously. And we're not even looking at technologies now which takes water out of the air at nighttime. So it looks like a solar panel on your roof, and the next morning you wake up and you got enough potable water for the day. And you just took it out of the sky above your home. So I think we can solve all those problems. And in the developing world, that's a different issue. But some of these solutions are actually very portable and not infrastructure heavy.
I just want to echo that. Like, the only strong feeling I have about dealing with seawalls is exactly as you said, to talk to the Dutch. Right? They've been had like this for half a millennia, and they do in general know their business. And I agree with you strongly on there are creative solutions to the water issue. As an economist, I particularly want to push back on, and this is just follows along your drip versus flood irrigation. The fact that we basically provide subsidized water for much of American agriculture in the West feels completely crazy to me.
Yeah,
in fact,
exactly.
the people should pay for the social costs of what they're doing, whether or not that's a residential water use or agricultural water use.
Yeah, exactly. And when you see it, well, they just open the floodgates. It's like, oh my gosh, it's like it's underwater. And so it's pretty wasteful, to be sure. What about infrastructure? So what's the solution for particularly aging infrastructure and or the provision for new infrastructure? So a lot of these new communities have to build new infrastructure. Older communities are repairing infrastructure. And we don't seem to have kind of a policy or a track record of harnessing the private sector to take on infrastructure.
Well, it's a fantastic challenge for America. We're very bad at doing it, actually, in terms of costs, right? So if you look at the transit cost database, which is housed at NYU, and I compare the costs of doing things like subways in New York versus, or any place in America versus other parts of the world, America is just very, very costly. And we're costly in, the Turner and Townsend numbers suggest we're also costly in office, at least in sort of New York and San Francisco, not in Houston. Houston looks good on those costs. But I think in terms of the infrastructure, we've got a procurement problem. And, it's what combination this is of the way that we've written the regulations around procurement so you don't have very much competition among the providers, the extent to which we think it is we're just asking something different from our subways. We're making sure that nobody is inconvenienced, and that's adding to the costs. It's hard to know, but our costs have gone up a lot over time, and they're not matched by other places in the world. And this is, I think, a really big and important challenge for America. I mean, procurement in general. I mean, it seems to loses listeners immediately, but it's 15% of global GDP and it's just a very big deal. And it's in terms of what policies I think I know are good on infrastructure. So first of all, new development should pay for the incremental cost of any infrastructure it creates. That feels like it's a pretty no-brainer.
Right.
We need to figure out where, in terms of the property tax payments, we can, make sure that we can pay for existing infrastructure as maintenance. I think we can do infrastructure maintenance better. So I've been engaged in an infrastructure-related project that involves cell phone data from Uber. So I have access to about a month's worth of cell phone data from basically all the Uber drivers in America. And I'm not interested in anything about where they're going or who they're taking or anything. I'm just interested in how bumpy their drives are. And so all of our cell phones have these, essentially what are accelerometers, which are things that are like what the Department of Transportation has used to measure road roughness on highways for 50 years, but they've never measured local roads. And so we can now measure local roads everywhere in the country. We can look at things like how much smoother are roads in disproportionately white neighborhoods versus disproportionately African-American neighborhoods, to what extent does smoothness rise with income. The answer is there are large differences between rich and poor. It's mostly about town. It's not actually within town very much.
Right.
Or we can measure how much people slow down when they get rougher roads, and the answer is quite a lot. We're losing a lot of time because of our rough roads. And we can also look at how well cities like New York and Chicago target their road repaving. And at least the preliminary answers that we're looking at is actually they do a pretty poor job of it. That in fact, the smoothest 30% of roads are less likely to be repaved, but among the roughest 70% of roads, there's very little correlation between how rough the roads are and how likely they are to be repaved. The smart highways also creates a real, you mentioned the old mantra, bus good, train bad, which is, mostly about just pure cost. It's also about flexibility. But, the new technologies make that even more plausible. So instead of thinking about a rail linkage between, let's say, two places that are 100 miles apart, think about just putting a dedicated highway lane that just goes for autonomous vehicles, where you run a bus at 150 miles an hour on this stuff. It'll cost pennies on the dollar relative to trying to put a rail network. You can use it for cars as well, as long as the cars are playing by the rules and are also autonomous. And it's just a vastly better option, I would think, in many cases.
I totally agree with you. I've been thinking about, we'd have a culvert, and in the culvert, we have the utilities, wastewater, freshwater management, utilities, communication. In the top of the culvert is a dedicated autonomous vehicle runway. So we got to run all the infrastructure anyway. So rather than bury it on the sides of the road, let's make it the middle of the road. Still have conventional road on either side of it. Then you can always get, get into the culvert.
Beautiful.
To make repairs. But I think you're right that as autonomous vehicles come, their first instance, we're going to have to give them dedicated rail. And then you can have the bike path right beside it. I mean, there's lots of different ways you can agglomerate these different modes of transportation. I think mobility is going to be, I won't say a game changer, but it's a new dynamic that we have to take into account when we plan cities now. So when I come to Harvard and I come to Cambridge, I'm jealous because to me, we talked a lot about public education and lower schools, but higher education and the presence of a university is such a strong force for a city. And unfortunately, we've got 4,000 universities in this country, but we don't necessarily have them all pulling cities together. I'm just wondering if there's any way in which you see that changing. Are you worried that we're going to go from 4,000 to 3,000, or do you think we're going to go from 4,000 to 6,000?
I worry, first of all, there's a great Daniel Patrick Moynihan line from, I don't know, 40 years ago when asked, how do you make a great city? He answered, get 2 world-class universities and wait 50 years, right? There's a certain truth to that. The education is the life's blood of urban areas, and that's about lower schools, and it's also about higher ed, which is about both, training people, but also having professors who are often engaged with the economy. After the Bayh-Dole Act enabled, commercialization of federally funded research, there was really a flowering of commercial activity around universities. The work of Naomi Hausman from Hebrew University really documents this. What's going to happen in my industry? I don't know. I feel pretty good about our model here, which is very much about intensive face-to-face contact and giving a very urban feeling to this. But when it comes to the education that matters for a much larger number of Americans, it's not clear this model is affordable. It's not clear that this model is a doable one. And we've got lots of changes in technology. I tend to believe that face-to-face is important everywhere, but certainly it can be supplemented with video stuff and with other tools. So I think just like the sort of technology means that our transportation infrastructure is in flux, I think the technology means that the scope of higher education is likely to be in flux, at least outside of the most elite institutions. I think that creates lots of. Texas has great universities, but there can be more, and I think this is a great scope for Texas entrepreneurship to and Phoenix entrepreneurship to think about what can be done here that's exciting and new in different spaces.
Interesting. It's been a really good day to think about the kinds of things we have to take into account. Obviously, we don't have all the answers, but hopefully this is a path where we're going to be consulting lots of people like yourself to help us really think about the future and how we plan for the future, because things are changing rapidly.
The wisdom of cities comes from the fact that they bring a lot of people together.
Right,
and that's sort of critical in building cities as well.
And all those different points of view become really, really important, especially the visionaries.